Good morning, good evening. Welcome to week 3 here of MPAI 600 here at Georgetown University's Applied Intelligence program. Just want to start off with announcements. I think we had a good Zoom session for those of you who came on Friday. I think they definitely got good info on the collection strategy. The collection strategy is due now, depending on when you're watching this, so make sure you get that in. But we also talked about jobs and working in the national intelligence field or national security field. And the one thing I mentioned to them that I want to reiterate for everyone else is there are a series of internships at the major agencies, National Geospatial Agency, Homeland Security, all of Homeland Security's subcomponents that are open to graduate students only. And the deadlines are coming up. They're usually in the early fall, so they can apply, so you can work the next summer at one of these agencies full time. So I would implore you to look at those right now, so you can start any applications, particularly if you're on the lower end, and I don't want to say on the lower end, but you're a relatively new college graduate, or you're just coming out of the military, and you want to look at some sort of transition. So please look at those internship deadlines right now, surf on the internet, see when they are, and go ahead and start applying for them because you're competitive just by being a grad student. So moving on to current events, just like you do for me, I'll try and use this to touch on current events. And obviously the Virginia Beach shooting is probably the big current event here. And I bring this up every time we have a shooting, whether it's a mental health issue or whether it's radicalization from right-wing extremists or Islamic extremists. There's questions that continue to come up. And oftentimes you'll hear this refrain, and we haven't gotten a lot of information back yet from Virginia Beach, but you'll hear the refrain, how did you not know? You know, the signs are all there. How did you not know? And that brings up some questions that are relevant. You know, what could have been done after the fact? So, are we Monday morning quarterbacking, or were there legitimate procedures that could have been followed that could have prevented, if not Virginia Beach, you know, the Parkland shooter from Florida last year, the right-wing extremist, the right-wing shooter in New Zealand, Nadal Hassan, the Fort Hood shooter, the Orlando shooter. You know, all of them had indicators before the fact that they were radicalized. But what could have been done is the question. And, you know, the question is, when does radicalization and mental health deserve further scrutiny? And this always comes up when one of these incidents happen. If I were to surf on an Islamic extremist website or an ISIS website, should that put me on some sort of watch list? Well, one, I'm exercising my free speech in many ways, but two, there's hundreds of thousands of people that surf on Islamic extremist websites. What is an Islamic extremist website? What is a right-wing website? You know, if I'm participating in on 4chan, which is a huge base for right-wing extremists, should I be put on a watch list? Where is the line? If I interact with an ISIS extremist, should I be put on a watch list? You know, going from a passive listener to an active viewpoint, should I be put on a watch list? These are all legitimate questions that happen. And of course, again, after several of these incidents, you look back and they were surfing on Islamic extremists. They were interacting with ISIS operatives in some way. So the question is, when do we deserve further scrutiny? When does it triage? And the same goes for mental health issues. Right now, in Virginia, if I were to check myself into a mental health facility because of depression or any number of issues, I can still go, as soon as I come out of the facility, and go purchase a weapon. If I went down the street in Maryland, I could not. I would be put on a watch list in Maryland if I checked myself voluntarily into a mental health facility. Now, if I was involuntarily committed, then that's a different story. But where is the line on mental health? If I were taking antidepressants, should I be put on a watch list for potential scrutiny? if I were taking antipsychotics, which are more severe medication, if I checked myself in, should I be voluntarily? Should I should I be uh, should I be have my gun rights restricted? Again, I'll let you decide, but different states have different laws. And then we bring up to the final issue, the gap. I call it the gap between when we know something, but there's not enough to detain. We know, again, all sorts of mental health issues for some of these shooters. We know all sorts of radicalization issues for some of these Islamic extremists or right-wing extremists. But there's not enough out there to arrest him. I'll give you the Fort Hood shooting, which we'll talk about in a later section. If we had known, let's say we knew that Nidal Hasan was communicating with Al-Qaeda operatives. Let's say we knew he had Islamic extremists and he showed sign of radicalization. There was still not enough to detain him. He did not commit a crime until he started to open fire at that Fort Hood shooting processing center. And that goes for all sorts of other figures. Again, we know they're on the radar of law enforcement, but there's not enough to detain them or to commit them for a mental health evaluation. And that's the gap. And that's the gap where a lot of these shooters and a lot of these radicalized individuals lay in. And that's part of the problem. And one of your questions on your final is going to be, how do we close that gap? So start thinking about that now. So going back to our class, we talked about requirements and we talked about intelligence traps going in the previous week. Again, your requirements, you've hopefully satisfied that in your collection plan. And then the intelligence traps or analytical flaws. We had confirmation bias, which was when you think about your first impression and all other evidence is used to feed into that first impression. I think you saw that in some of the case studies that were talked about in the book, but you saw that in the confessions. Mirror imaging. This is a common one we use where we believe that our adversary is going to follow the same type of playbook that we are doing. That's a classic one. And again, you saw some of these in the confessions, the documentary. And again, I can't emphasize enough in your discussion posts, I want you to read or take the theory that we talk about and apply it to the case studies. This is, again, classic confirmation bias. And before we say it's a rogue cop, as many of you cited in your discussion sections, prosecutors fell under this, juries fell under this, appellate court judges all fell under these sorts of biases going forward. So you had confirmation bias. You had vividness bias. You saw the tapes being played of the confessions in those courtroom scenes where they were that trumped the DNA evidence and the other alibi evidence that was more relevant to the case. But hearing the confession really impacted the jury. And then vividness bias occurs as well with the pictures of the dead woman, the victim in this case. And this is something that it's different in different states, but one might argue that showing that picture of a victim in a trial should not be allowed. That it radicalizes the jury, for a better term, when in fact a picture of a dead person really doesn't tell you that the person who's accused of the crime is actually the perpetrator. But yeah, that's a classic example of vividness bias, where we use pictures and illustrations overcome more concrete pieces of evidence. And then the last thing I'll just say, I don't know if any of you are Catholic, Jesuit, religious, if this really matters, or anything along those lines. But Georgetown just tried to instill values of justice in this curriculum. And this is a classic example of injustice. And just FYI, this case just ended about 3 months ago with the final, when these, for those of you who don't know, they were released from jail in 2009. Their convictions were vacated in 2014, and just in 2019, a few months ago in January, they received compensation from the county for the crimes that they were falsely committed of. So the justice finally worked, 20 years after the fact. But again, this is an example of leaders, I would say, not doing their jobs, whether it's at the detective level, the police department level, municipal level, all the way up to, I'd say, the governor's level, and not having a sense of justice in this case. And then the last thing I'll say, a previous student brought this up, and it's worthy to consider. We talked about biases a lot in this course, but good people have biases. Bad people, like Detective Ford, just have criminal intent. And I think that's an accurate statement. Detective Ford didn't have biases. He was just a criminal in that position, trying to get his person arrested without any other foresight. I would probably agree with that. I would also just say that there are a lot of people in that chain, juries, judges, prosecutors, who fell victim to their own biases. So I'll let you decide on that, but I hope you can take these lessons going forward, not just in the rest of the course, but in your professional work as well. So week 3 preview. As I've mentioned, I like to use history in this course, and we're going back a little bit in time to look at some of the key intel failures in history. And this is kind of strategic surprise. So Pearl Harbor and the Yom Kippur War are the 2 case studies that we're going to talk about. And the question to look at is not just, well, one, this isn't a history lesson. I want you to look at why these failures occurred, and specifically where along the line, the collection cycle or the intel cycle, did the failure occur? Did it occur at the very beginning with poor collection? Did it occur with poor analysis that you talked about in the last chapter? Was there a problem with interfacing between intelligence people and military and policy folks? Did the policymakers fail to act? Were there underlying circumstances, just bad luck, that allowed some of these intelligence failures to occur that were completely outside the realm of the intelligence community in both countries? So we're going to ask, why did these 2 failures occur? These were critical failures. Known threats were out there, yet these 2 sophisticated intelligence services, the United States and Israel, failed to pick up these massive surprises. So the readings, again, the Dahl, very great chapters on it, on Pearl Harbor. The Yom Kippur War, the Riddell article, we'll cover that, and the documentaries, Al Jazeera, The Crossing. You really need to go, it's an hour-long documentary. The first half hour will suffice, because it'll talk about the intelligence failure specifically. So with that being said, I look forward to your discussion posts, and if there's questions or issues, let me know.